Hi everyone, my name is Melinda Hinkson. I'm the Director of the Institute of Postcolonial Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here for this third forum this year in our international series of discussions on decolonising truth. Once again, IPCS is really pleased to be co-hosting this series with our friends at the Alfred Deakin Institute. Let me acknowledge country and First Nations elders, owners and custodians across all of the lands from which we're joining together this evening. I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and all First Nations people who are on this call. And let me single out particularly the commissioners and other good people from the Uluru Justice Commission. We're really delighted to be helping facilitate these transnational dialogues at what is such an important time for Victoria. Tonight's event follows a really wonderful panel we held at Curzon Street a year and a half ago with the Animatism Artists Collective, who work between Australia and the Free Art School in Timor-Leste. And I think our friend and IPCS visiting fellow Michael Fakaris is joining us tonight. The recent history of Timor-Leste casts such a long and complex shadow across Australia. Tonight's discussion is such an important one for us to have. Let me extend a warm greeting to all Timorese people who are with us and to our very esteemed panel of speakers. I'm now going to hand over to Vanessa Borolski to introduce the panel. And as I do, I say thanks, Vanessa, once again for all of your efforts in convening this terrific series. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Melinda. And I just want to reiterate your greetings to everybody who was able to join us tonight. I'm really sure that it'll be an amazing and stimulating discussion. I also just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm located, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this country and the extraordinary gift which this protection provides for us all. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. I recognise that they've never ceded sovereignty, and I also recognise my own position as a settler migrant. So I'd like to start just by acknowledging the wonderful diversity and rich knowledge and experience in this virtual room. And we've got participants here from countries around the world, including registrants from Australia, Brazil, Timor-Leste itself, London and elsewhere. And we're also, as Melinda said, very honoured to have several commissioners from the Uluru Justice Commission, which was recently established to oversee truth-telling in the Victoria State. And they've joined us for this conversation tonight. And I think I just wanted to start by talking about the notion of conversation, because I think often we focus very much on the question of decolonising truth-telling, but I also think it's critical that we try and bring some of those decolonising practices and into processes like this one. And for me, as a starting point, that's about building respectful, ongoing relationships and creating an environment in which we can have deep listening and open dialogue. We invite you to use this virtual space in that way this evening. So just to give you a bit of background, as Melinda said, the Alfred Deakin Institute and the Institute of Postcolonial Studies have been running a series of seminars about truth-telling since 2020 to try and engage with and respond to the call for truth-telling that was articulated most recently and formally in the Uluru Statement, which I think has a long history preceding that. So what we did last year is we tried to bring together largely Australian scholars who had grappled with difficult questions around Australia's colonial history and its contemporary legacy for many years. And there are a lot of amazing scholars and activists who've been grappling with that history for a long time. So what we wanted to do was try and create a space for an in-depth conversation about both the possibilities and challenges of truth-telling in Australia in the light of the release of the Uluru Statement. Another objective of those seminars was to try and create a space where the unfolding national conversation around truth-telling could be linked to conversations around decolonization, and to ask, what would a decolonial truth process look like? And did this concern new methodologies or types of processes, or does it concern an aspiration for a decolonial future, or does it mean both? I think as many people here will probably agree, too often truth-telling processes have focused too narrowly on questions of recognition and reconciliation, and often to the detriment of meaningful engagement with questions of reparations and redress, and in some instances have ended up actually undermining Indigenous sovereignty. So the question remains, how do you actually design truth processes that recognize colonial violation, which I think is an important desire and aspiration, but in a way that leads to meaningful redress of power imbalances, and which also builds sovereignty, self-determination, and genuine relationships of equality. I think in Australia, we've seen what happened with previous reconciliation processes. So, I mean, that is just one of many challenging questions related to the challenge of decolonizing truth-telling. So obviously these are very huge issues, and I think I'm myself only beginning to really grasp and appreciate the complexities of those issues. So I'd invite you, if you have time or the inclination is to actually go and look at some of the seminars that we recorded from last year, which are on the Institute of Postcolonial Studies website, which you can have a look at any time. So just to talk about what we're trying to do in these seminars, this year what we wanted to try and do was to bring the developing conversation around truth-telling in Australia into a critical dialogue with international experiences of truth-telling. I think there have been more than 35 Truth Commission processes globally since the 1980s. And I think one may well ask, what is so compelling about these processes, and why have so many countries turned to them in the wake of conflict across enormously different contexts and continents? How can we understand the hope which is invested in them to transform and mold societies into sustainable and meaningful democracies? I think we see this hope invested in Australia's deepening engagement with the promises of truth, and the way in which this promise has also been shaped very much both implicitly and explicitly, I think, by international experiences. So in that context, we wanted to explore how we could draw from the rich experience and hard-won insights of truth processes in other parts of the world to enrich the process here. So this is not with the intention of looking for generic models or pat lessons that can be transposed uncritically from one environment to the next, but the kind of insight which I think can only come from deep and sustained listening to the experiences of others, hence my emphasis on the question of conversation. So in these seminars we've organized this year, we've tried to foreground truth-telling processes that have impacted on Indigenous communities and those in this region. In September, we ran a seminar on the Colombian truth process, which I think revealed some of the extraordinary insights and also spoke to the value of taking the time to listen across language barriers. Laura, who's here, will speak to the complexities of doing that, about how communities in different contexts are grappling with the challenge of actually understanding what decolonizing truth means, both conceptually and practically. I think we can draw much wisdom from the thinking that has taken place in that context, as I'm sure we will from the conversations that happen here tonight. So in early December, we plan to hold an event focusing on the Solomon Islands, which is the first Pacific country to convene a truth process, and which I think will reveal further fascinating insights about truth-telling in a very different environment. And we hope to schedule further seminars in 2022 on truth processes in the US and Canada and possibly other environments. we're very open to your suggestions about the truth processes that you think might be interesting and valuable for you to hear about. So tonight, as Melinda has indicated, we're honoured to have a number of extraordinary speakers who were at the heart of Timor-Leste's struggle to rebuild after the devastation left by Indonesia's occupation of the country. They'll be able to bring you intimate insights from a variety of perspectives of the truth process and about the country itself. There are also a number of individuals in the audience I know who have had also significant experience and understanding of Timor-Leste, and I'm sure they'll also contribute to the discussion. Timor-Leste is on Australia's doorstep geographically, and there's been a long and complex and sometimes neo-colonial relationship between the two countries. However, I think Timor-Leste remains largely absent from mainstream Australian national discourse. Unfortunately, I think we're unlikely to rectify that here tonight, but I think what we can do is listen and learn and draw on the rich experience of the Timor-Leste truth process to build insights that will deepen our understanding and experience of truth-telling in the Australian context. Each of the speakers will give a brief input of approximately 10 minutes discussing, among other things, their own experience and understanding of the Timor-Leste truth process and looking at how Australia could draw on those experiences in developing its own approach to truth-telling, as well as engaging or trying to engage with the question of what we mean by a decolonial approach to truth-telling. I know all of those are enormous questions to tackle in 10 minutes, but we'll have approximately 40 to 50 minutes after that for discussion and questions. So hopefully we'll be able to draw out some of the detail. You're welcome to post questions in the Q&A box or make comments in the chat during the presentations. And after the presentations, you can virtually raise your hand and we'll come to you to ask your question. So, and just please remember to mute yourself after that so that we don't have a whole lot of unwelcome background noise like my dog barking. So I'll very briefly introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll give presentations. Apologies in advance for any clumsy pronunciation. Rather than reading out each speaker's full biographies, which you can get from the Deakin or IPCS websites, I'll just try and give you a little bit of a sense of the work they've done. So please know that I'm not doing them justice here in these brief overviews. We'll start with Pat Walsh, who's an Australian who's worked in Timor-Leste between 1999 and 2014. He was seconded by the UN to help establish and advise the Truth and Reconciliation Process, CAVR, in Timor-Leste, and he was one of the editors of CHEGA, the English version of the East Timor Truth Commission report, which was released in 2014. In 2016, he was engaged by Prime Minister Rui Araujo to help design a follow-up Centre of Memory, now called the Centro Nacional CHEGA, for which he continues to be an international advisor. Then after that, we will have Hugo Fernandez, who is actually the Chief Executive Officer at Centro Nacional CHEGA, which is the history museum established to house the material generated by the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation. Hugo has more than 20 years of experience in journalism, transitional justice and public policy, and he was head of the truth-seeking department at CAVR and co-managing editor for the Commission's report, CHEGA. Then we'll hear from Galowan Dieter, who's co-founder and director of the Asia Justice and Rights organization, a non-profit human rights organization based in Bali since 2012. Previously, she was deputy director of the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation in Timor-Leste, and she's currently co-convener of the Coalition for Justice and Truth in Indonesia, a member of a citizens' council tasked to seek the truth on Indonesia's past crimes. Then lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Lea Kent from the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, who's been conducting research on peace building in Timor-Leste for nearly 20 years. In a recent DECRA project, she looked at how East Timorese communities are remembering the violence of the Indonesian occupation, and she documented the widespread practices of local communities and families in searching for, identifying, and reburying the bodies of those who died during the 24-year Indonesian occupation. She's recently been awarded a future fellowship to conduct comparative research on community responses to missing persons in Sri Lanka and Timor-Leste. Okay, after that quite long introduction, I'll just hand over to Pat to share his amazing experiences. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Vanessa and Carlos, and hello, everybody. I'm obviously not Indigenous Timorese or Australian, so a bit embarrassed to be starting the bowling, but Hugo's been delayed, our East Timorese colleague, and will join us. My respects to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and elders from whose traditional country in Northcote I am speaking, and may I also acknowledge what a privilege it was to work for East Timor's Reconciliation, Truth and Justice Commission, CAVR, its Portuguese acronym, and to be part of its search for truth and justice. I'm sure any non-Indigenous Australians lucky enough to work in Europe will also have a privileged human and immensely historical experience. One obvious similarity between East Timor's CAVR Commission and the Europe Justice Commission is that both organisations are addressing, if you like, the deep impact of foreign colonisation. In CAVR's case, this meant addressing only the last 25 years of colonialism under Indonesia, not the full sweep of some 4 or 5 centuries of Portuguese colonialism, a huge chapter in East Timor's history that some think ought to be the subject of a Truth Commission as well. Europe, of course, will deal with 2 centuries of colonialism. But either way, both experiences in East Timor and for the First Peoples of Victoria had a lot in common. Both involved denial of the fundamental human right of self-determination, theft of resources, displacement, racism, removal of children, sexual violence, massacres, impoverishment, and so on and so on. The truth-telling undertaken by CAVR illustrated that vividly, very humanly. We put a lot of emphasis on letting people actually tell their story, and compellingly, and I'm sure the Europe process will do the same here. The big difference, though, is that CAVR was set up and functioned in what could be called a post-colonial setting. CAVR was established after the occupier had left, following an act of self-determination in the form of the 1999 referendum. Europe, of course, is pre that stage and is stage 1 in a process that is intended to lead to an exercise in sovereignty in the form of a treaty rather than the other way around. Other critical outcomes, including a self-determination fund and a voice on state policies, will, it is planned, follow from the Europe platform foundation of truth-telling. Hopefully real and practical enough to satisfy grassroots Indigenous expectations about Europe. I mention that because, as other speakers will say, a lot of the people, a lot of the very ordinary people who testified to CAVR had very bread and butter type expectations of what it would deliver to them individually and their families. In other words, Europe truth-telling will facilitate, truth-telling in Europe will the truth-telling Uruk will facilitate comes at the start of a process, not the end. This means that CAVR and Uruk, though both tasked with documenting what Bob Woodward, author of all those books on Trump, has called the best obtainable version of the truth, have fundamentally different missions. CAVR's mission could be summarised as one, to head off the possibility of post-independence violence by facilitating reconciliation within the East Timorese community and not reconciliation with Indonesia. And secondly, to make findings on human rights violations, including who did what to whom and why, naming names and holding individuals and institutions accountable. As far as I know, peace building and human rights accountability in that CAVR sense are not directly part of Uruk's brief. Further difference is that the perpetrators of most of the violence in East Timor departed before CAVR's establishment, and though found massively guilty by CAVR and other processes, were, in an irony of history, beyond the reach of independent East Timor's legal jurisdiction. This has meant that many of the perpetrators, or big fish as the Timorese often call them, escaped justice and accountability, and by and large, Indonesian society continues to sit in the dark about what actually happened on the ground in East Timor. Either to believe that Indonesia played a good role in Timor, or to promote an alternative version of the truth, or simply to forget all about it. A pattern on the past, all too familiar here in Australia in relation to our Indigenous past. On the brighter side, of course, the fact that the perpetrators, or many of them, had left, permitted truth-seeking in East Timor to proceed in a manner that would have been unthinkable had they still been present on the ground. In Uruk's case, the descendants and beneficiaries of Victoria's first settlers and the beneficiaries of the violence of those times, if you like, remain very much part of the scene. They continue to rule and to date have determined the narrative. Seems to me, therefore, that for Uruk to work successfully and reach the goals mentioned above, much will depend on the informed goodwill of the non-Indigenous community in Victoria, and therefore the efficacy and reach of Uruk's truth-telling exercise. As Professor Marcia Langton put it some time ago, the Uruk process has a very significant role in educating the broader community about Indigenous history. Truth-telling, of course, requires truth listening. Through its report and other processes, CAVR effectively addressed three publics: the East Timorese community, Indonesia, and the international community. The East Timorese community definitely listened, and the new Centre of Memory, which Hugo Fernandez, who will speak later, now manages, has been established to continue this process, and particularly to help the young born since independence, and therefore with no direct experience of oppression and colonisation under Indonesia and the country's future leaders, hopefully will listen and learn from that history preserved by CNC and transmitted by it. The response of Indonesia and the international community, however, was a very different story. The international community, including Australia, gave financial and other support to CAVR, but has basically ignored its report and its findings and recommendations. As mentioned, Indonesia has basically put the past behind it. It believes past is past, and that's true of many other instances of violence during Indonesia's colonial history and its post-independence history. These international and Indonesian responses tell me that those with vested interests or those embarrassed by the truth do in fact find it very hard to listen. The age-old reflex to dismiss criticism in self-defence kicks in. Might Yurok have the same experience? Will non-Indigenous Victorians, confronted with the unvarnished truth, embrace it? More so, will they listen deeply enough to agree to a treaty and give Indigenous Victorians a meaningful voice to power? Should Victoria, for example, change governments at the next election, God forbid, will the incoming government commit to Yurok like the present one? I'm reminded that Alan Tudge, Australia's Minister for Education, said last week he was unhappy with the proposed new history curriculum, and he wanted Australian schools to teach a positive, optimistic view of Australian history, and he deplored what he sees as a tendency to present pre-1788 history as good and post-1788 history as bad. Hugo will outline the 5 or so truth-seeking mechanisms used by CAVR, but bearing in mind Yurok's outreach to Victoria's scattered, diverse, highly multicultural, and perhaps with great respect, largely ignorant community about Aboriginal past, and the importance of ensuring truth-telling is long-term and intergenerational, I'd just like to end by highlighting 2 of CAVR's programs as good model. First, CAVR, I believe, used public hearings effectively. These were organised first at the local level, very local level, for victims and survivors who'd already testified to CAVR individually, to share their story with that local community in a public forum, and to experience the healing of finally being listened to. The Commission also held a number of high-profile national public hearings on significant themes, including, I might add, self-determination and the attitude of the international community to the exercise of that fundamental right in East Timor. These national public hearings were broadcast live on television and radio, reported in the print media, videoed and recorded for future educational use. They were also very well attended by the Timorese public, internationals, and foreign media who were in East Timor at that time. All were highly emotional, and some were quite risky, like that on East Timor's internal conflict in 1975, sometimes referred to as the civil war that preceded Indonesia's invasion, at which Timorese testified about violence committed against them by other Timorese. Above all, they demonstrated the terrible harm done to ordinary people when the rule of law is replaced by impunity, and the power of truth to potentially influence attitudes and behaviour. Lastly, I would highlight the obvious but critical importance of preserving the evidence, archiving it, and the stories of survivors in all their media forms. CAVR and its successor bodies have taken this responsibility very seriously. Still a major work in process, but one that is precious to the memory of the country, a society with largely an unwritten history because of the oral tradition and levels of illiteracy left by Portugal and so on, but used educatively, and of course, assuming access by all those who need to use them, they will serve as a permanent reference point and policy determinant down the generations, including, I believe, eventually for Indonesia. It's taken Australia 200 years to get to this point. I haven't given up on Indonesia yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was really fascinating. Hugo, I see you've joined us, so I'm struggling to see you on the screen, but if you could do your presentation now, that would be great. Is Hugo there on the screen? He was there a moment ago.
Yes, sorry. I am following the presentation. Unfortunately, my event at center is not included, but I listened to the presentation from Pat Walsh. And I think he covers a lot of things that happens in CAVR. But once again, thank you for the invitation to Vanessa. My name is Hugo Fernandes. I'm currently work for Centro Nacional Chega in Dili. It's a privilege to be in this panel to share some of the experience of Timor-Leste. And I see some of familiar faces that has been in this process together since 20 years ago, even some more than 20 years ago. So it made me think that it is maybe some lessons and experience has been sharing among the participants in this forum today. As Pat was described, how all the process of truth-telling in Timor-Leste, I think fundamentally, why is Timor-Leste, the question that I think it is need to be considered is that why Timor-Leste immediately after referendum, even before get its official independence, Timor-Leste immediately accepted to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Unlike other countries where the conflict ended sometimes some years after that, then the Truth Commission was established. But in Timor-Leste, immediately after the conflict, some of the Timorese even still remain in West Timor, some still in overseas, like in Australia, Portugal, and some other countries. But the leaders has decided to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Timor-Leste. I think the focus at the time is more on how to immediately reconcile with Indonesia. And I remember when in a conference in August year 2000, before the dissolving of the CNRT at the time, some of the leaders say that we can choose who is our members of the family, but we can never choose who is our neighbor. And I think Timor-Leste is geographically located by land, neighboring with Indonesia, and also particularly because more than 250,000 Timorese were in Indonesia because of the 1999 popular consultation. And I think CAVR established more to see what the state can provide response to that situation. One, more like heavily to immediately resolve the case with Indonesia, but also it's less attention to revealing the truth about what happened in Timor-Leste, particularly during the period of civil war until I think before the Indonesian invasion. So the CAVR established with regulation from UNTAED, which is have a very specific mandate, which is to investigate human rights violation that occurred during the political conflict in 1975 to 1999. That mandate is, for us at the time, it's quite complex because first, when we apply all this methodology, one of the main challenges is that people still don't willing to talk about what happened, particularly in regard to the internal conflict. And that's provide quite challenges to the CAVR at the time to establish, at least to design what type of methodology that appropriate, but not really complex, to enabling people to tell the truth about what happened during 24 years. So the methodology was designed based on that context first. And then secondly, looking at the socio-demographic of Timor-Leste, more than 50% of Timorese were illiterate. And that's why we need to design a methodology that responds to their situation. So it's more questions that needed to be asked by the Commission instead of response that voluntarily provided by the people. So Pat was describing about that statement-taking process, which is during that period we gathered about 8,000 statements from victims and witnesses. And that semi-structure form was created and tested. And then I can say that it is a lead questions in order to respond to the CAVR mandate, in order to respond to who did what to whom, and when and why. So the statement-taking process is particularly a lead process that makes sure that people telling what happened to them, but that's also responds to the socio-demographic condition at the time. Of course, because of the time limit, we cannot receive all the information from all the people. And at the time, the Commission only decided that 8,000 statements is enough to represent 1% of the total population of Timor-Leste in 1999, I think. So that's semi-structured questions and then analysis, and then we put on some coding and then just to identify who did what to whom and then why and etc. So that's one of the methodology. But again, the difficulty is again, as I said before, most of the Timorese were illiterate. Some even don't remember the names of the actors, or even if military, they don't remember from what unit of the military that committed some violation to them. Because of that limitation, then the commissions create another methodology, which is how to gather information, which is more focused on research, thematic research, which is also Pat was describing before. That research is particularly focused on the very important persons or VIPs or eminent individuals. This is to link between the fact in the field and also perhaps the policy, or at least some of context of what happened in Timor-Leste at the time. So we combine these two methodology of truth-telling. One is very crossroad approach, and another one is we identify the eminent individuals, and when we design the questions, and then we have a team to interview them, and then asking very in-depth questions to the individuals. So we gathered about 1,500 in-depth interviews that divided in thematic issues, crossing from the political conflict to the various types of human rights violation that happen in Timor-Leste. So aside from them, we also conduct public hearings, as was already described, which is also a part of first to clarify what happened to the information that already gathered, but also to provide space for people to be recognize their participation in that process. So while doing all this truth telling and also seeking the truth, the CAVR also providing space for people to be here. And that process also can be considered as a healing process for the victims and also for the witnesses. And of course, we also receive submissions where the Commission identify particular institutions, particular individual that knows about what happened in Timor-Leste during that period to provide us with a report, detailed reports with the questions that are sent by the Commission. So that kind of methodology or truth-seeking process that we went through during the period of CAVR time. And then we also apply some very advanced research where we cooperate with one of the scientific group from the United States to conduct what we call mortality rate survey, which is try to prove how many people exactly died during 24 years. So different methodology apply, which is particularly, I think, was designed to respond to the mandate by law. So I think all those methodology were designed in order to respond to the regulations, which is to investigate human rights violation that occur in Timor-Leste. Of course, because of the time limit and also because Timorese just came out from the conflict, after CAVR, there are a lot of questions that people say that they were never included in the process. There are a lot of history that were not even completed or collected by CAVR. So I think that's one of the limitations, because the CAVR was only provide 4 years to write the history of 24 years under the occupation of Indonesia, but also during the period of internal conflict. As I said before, in particular to the internal conflict, there are not much covered by the CAVR, but also what happened in 1999, it's also not really much covered by CAVR. Luckily, because we received a submission from Professor Jeffrey Robinson that his report on what happened in Timor-Leste in 1999 were accepted as a part of the CAVR report. So that provided a little bit more balance between the early year of conflict and also before the conflict was ended in 1999. Currently, at the Centro Nacional Chega, we continue to collect more information, do more research and thematic research as part of providing space for people to continue telling the truth about what happened in Timor-Leste during the period of 1974 to 1999. Just now, since this morning, we have a seminar on reconciliation about what happened in Timor-Leste, where Timor-Leste is so proud about reconciliations with Indonesia, that one of the so-called model in the world, that we can reconcile with Indonesia, with Australia, with Portugal, with other countries. But internally in Timor-Leste, there are high demand of community to the state and government to provide space for people to talk about what happened in 1975 to 1978, particularly in the case of internal conflict. And as CNC, we have the privilege in the last 2 years to participate in this kind of reconciliation about, and mostly cases related to internal conflict in 1975 to 1978. And I think that's where the history that almost not really come up in our history textbooks in Timor-Leste at the moment. I think that kind of thing is provide an unbalance of historical narrative in Timor-Leste, because so far in the last 20 years, I can observe that most of the people always thought is the things that happen because of the Indonesian occupation, but not because of the internal conflict that continue remain as one of the unfinished business that resolved by the Timor-Leste government. I think that's what I can share. Thank you very much. I hope that Pat and Galuh later on can provide more context about what happened in Timor-Leste, especially lessons from CAVR, and that can be used as reference from our colleagues in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, for that interesting insight and some of the details of how the Commission actually functioned, which I think is really interesting. Galuh, would you like to step in?
Sure. I think I'm gonna try to share my screen if I can. Okay. So that you don't have to look at my face all the time. Hold on a second. Right. So thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today to speak after Pat and Hugo. Of course, we were very much a part of that community stuck in the Comarca Balide prison, trying to nut out what it means to do truth-telling in Timor-Leste at the time when, you know, it was so close to the destruction of what happened in 1999. My own sort of time then, I visited Australia at one point and went to Queensland and ended up going for a picnic at a place called Murder Creek. And I said, Murder Creek, why is it called Murder Creek? And my host said, oh, I don't know. I think some Aboriginal people were killed here sometime. And it just struck me so deeply actually at the time, because it resonated more to how Indonesia treated the mass graves of 1965 than the kind of the work that we were doing in Timor-Leste. So I'm very excited to have some of my colleagues from the Europe Justice Commission here, and the sort of continuing work that Indigenous people are doing in Australia to speak about the truth about what happened. I'm going to talk about how Timor-Leste's Truth Commission, CAVR, has had such an important legacy and contribution for truth-seeking across the region, and that truth-seeking is a continuing process. It is not just producing the one report. It is actually continuing, sort of excavating and pushing against impunity. I always say that, you know, impunity in our region, particularly in Indonesia and the Asia Pacific region, can be contagious, but at the same time, I think so is truth. So we are learning from our efforts in Timor-Leste, and that has now, in particularly at this moment, we are working with the Aceh Truth Commission, for example, and we are putting together the report of after 5 years of trying to gather the truth. And there's so much parallels. I feel a little bit of deja vu, because it's so many of the findings are the same. So on my picture here, I have a woman from Aceh, one of the stolen children from East Timor that we have been trying to find together between NGOs in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, with some support of the Centro National Chega and the Human Rights Commission. in Indonesia, and also sort of the challenge of the day for us in Asia, which is the conflict in Myanmar and the Rohingya, that many of them are victims of genocide and are now in the camps in Bangladesh. So, there's so many colonized truths, and this is very much contributing to this continuing impunity. Therefore, it's not only an issue of kind of historical curiosity. It is very much a part of this kind of struggle for democracy and for life in the region. And one of our challenge, of course, is the fact that, unlike other regions where there are regional human rights mechanisms that can push this right to truth. Of course, we know that a lot of the work on the right to truth have come from the Americas, but in our region, particularly where Indonesia is part ASEAN, there is the Human Rights Commission, Regional Human Rights Commission, is an intergovernmental commission with really no teeth. Even though in Article 5 of the Human Rights Declaration, there is the right to remedy, and the commissioners, some of the more progressive commissioners, are interrogating what does that mean, the right to remedy, but it is very much in paper only. And impunity is the norm, and there is definitely a return of the strongman politics across the region, and it is very difficult in a way, because in many contexts, particularly also in Indonesia, perpetrators are back to power. We have Wiranto indicted for crimes against humanity under the serious crimes process in Timor-Leste. In the previous administration, as the Minister for Security and Politics, and now we have our Minister of Defense, Prabowo. So the tide is not good for truth. It's going the other way. But what's interesting in the region is that, of course, with the finding of genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar, there are a plethora of international mechanisms, from the fact-finding mission for Myanmar and now the ICC, looking at the atrocities against the Rohingya in Bangladesh and in the Philippines, etc. So there is a little bit of grounds there, but it's also, it can be not locally owned, which can create new problems in terms of resistance and kind of new nationalism that then rejects this kind of difficult truth-telling that we are trying to accomplish. So we have CEGA, which I hope many of you have read the report or at least looked through it, and it has been obviously a really important report in the region, but Indonesia has basically done very little on the CEGA report, including not doing anything on the recommendation for apology. I think when we put out the CEGA report, the foreign minister at the time was asked about one of the findings, that napalm was used, and he said no, napalm was not used. Of course it wasn't, because it was opalm that was used. So and then it sort of kind of didn't go into officially didn't resonate in Indonesia. But I think its legacy has been the fact that we worked really hard to put victims in the center of our work, and that we created some really important participatory tools. And some of them you can read in the report. did something called community profiles, where we did mapping of sites of human rights violations. We used a timeline, these time-tested participatory action research tools in the community, so that it wasn't only individual testimonies, but also community-based and collective telling, including with some of the elders who had a lot of the knowledge about the past. So that was a really important piece of what we did at the CAVR. And the other piece, which I think is really relevant for the region and including for the context here in Australia, is working closely with civil society. We did the women's research with leading women's organization, Focal Pairs, and we did the public hearings on women together with them. And later on, the long 20 years later, women's groups have been, when the country forgot about the victims that already spoke out at the public hearings, it was civil society, women's groups that took on that role. So one of the things that we've been doing, civil society, during this vacuum has been looking for Timor-Leste stolen children. So this is a story that, not many people outside of the group, the people who've been working on East Timor and Indonesia know, but thousands of East Timorese children were taken during the occupation, first by soldiers, and then institutions got involved, religious institutions. So one of the things that we have been doing is we've created a working group between civil society in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and we've now found about 160 of these stolen children. Of course, they're no longer children because they were taken, back in 1975 to 1999. And these are some of the pictures of our searching and some of the reunions. And we've been able to reunite about 80 of them with their family members. If you look at the locations of where they are, so the number is not 147, it's 180 now, because even during COVID, we used social media to look for more. And so we have about 30 who are waiting to be reunited as soon as borders can open. So you can see that a lot of the children were taken in from the places where the resistance was very strong, so a lot from the eastern districts, and where we're finding them are places where the military have the battalions are based, so Sulawesi, Kalimantan, West Java, etc. So so this is work that's happening, decades later after the Truth Commission has completed its work. That's just some of the news coverage on the issue, and foreign correspondent reran our show last week. You can still watch it on iView. And lastly, I just want to end with the Aceh Truth Commission. It was established 2017. They had the commissioners, and this is some pictures of the public hearings. I mean, it was really done in a context where the soldiers and the military intelligence, the security sector is not feeling repentant. So they're asking, why are we doing public hearings? They're intimidating victims. But the Truth Commission in Aceh has been able to take about 5,000 testimonies. They've held 3 public hearings in the Aceh governor's building. Hall, it's much more muted, less resources, no international support, but they're doing a really important job. And we got Hugo and some of the truth-seeking researchers to come to Aceh, and also the commissioners have come to Timor-Leste. So there's been a lot of learning between the two institutions, even though it's like 20 years apart. So I do think that there's so many lessons that we can share, and this is just a little bit of a taste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Galuh. That was fascinating. Lea, can we end with you? Sorry.
Oh, Vanessa, thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Sure.
Hang on, I need your help, Carlos.
You should be able to do it now, Lea. Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much, Vanessa, for the opportunity to be part of this panel and this really important series, and also for the chance to reconnect with old friends. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which I stand, the Ngunnawal people in my case, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I come from a slightly different background from the other three speakers. So unlike Pat, Hugo and Galuh, I did not work for the CAVR, but I've done quite a bit of research on it. So for example, my PhD thesis looked at community experiences of the CAVR and also the serious crimes investigations process. And over the past 10 years or so, I've developed a strong interest in the ways in which East Timorese communities are negotiating the legacies of the Indonesian occupation in everyday ways that are largely outside of formal institutional structures. And I also want to preface my comments today by saying that Shaga is an incredibly valuable resource that I utilize regularly in my own work, and that the CAVR staff did an incredible work in a short space of time and in very difficult circumstances. That said, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back and spend a little bit of time thinking through some of the challenges of decolonizing truth-telling. I think the CAVR's experiences highlight that while a commitment to listening to and acknowledging marginalized voices is a critical aspect of a decolonizing approach, it's not sufficient. It's also necessary to reflect on the broader relations of power that impact on the possibilities of truth-telling. So in post-conflict contexts especially, truth-telling tends to be embedded within the framework of transitional justice. And this framework makes certain assumptions about the therapeutic and redemptive power of truth-telling for both individuals and nations, and is based on an idea of a rupture between the violent past and the peaceful future. And these assumptions are often taken for granted rather than reflected upon. So some of the questions I'd like to briefly touch on today include: how does transitional justice frame the possibilities of truth-telling? How does it influence the kinds of truths that can be told and heard, and the ways in which they are framed and presented? And what forms of knowledge or truths are obscured? And although transitional justice is generally a framework applied to post-conflict contexts, it's becoming increasingly globalized, such that I think these questions have relevance for thinking through truth-telling in settler colonial contexts like Australia. So let me begin with the assumption that underpins many truth commissions, that truth-telling is of therapeutic benefit to individuals. I think one of the things Timor-Leste's experiences teach us is that it's important to reflect on the conditions under which truth-telling might contribute to healing, as well as the expectations that such processes can raise. So one of the key themes that emerged during my PhD research was that while many East Timorese who told their stories to the CAVR welcomed the opportunity to do so, there was an intense desire to feel more than listened to. Truth-telling was understood as invoking responsibilities on the part of the listener and the state to respond to their experiences of harm, which were not in the past but continued into the present. So many of those I interviewed hoped that telling their stories would lead to practical outcomes. And these outcomes sometimes included financial assistance that would help them to transform lives of impoverishment, allow their children to get a decent education, and obtain medical care. Many also hoped the truth would help them locate, recover, and rebury the bodies of the dead. And they often expressed frustrations that these outcomes were not forthcoming. Truth-telling was also sometimes experienced as disempowering, for instance, when people felt that they did not know what had happened to their testimonies. So these insights, I think, suggest that a decolonizing approach to truth-telling invokes long-term responsibilities to those who tell their stories in terms of thinking of questions of reciprocity and redress. And I think both Pat and Galuh have touched on these long-term dimensions of truth-telling as well. So this brings me to a second point, related point, which is how might we think of truth-telling not as an end in itself, but as rather as part of an ongoing process of fostering debate about the legacies of the past in the present, and considering what this means for questions of justice, reform, and redress. The CAVR's work at the time was understood, like most truth commissions established in the aftermath of conflict, as a short-term project that would help to usher in a transition to a peaceful future. It was also unusually established by the United Nations during the period of UN transitional administration of the territory, even though it came to operate as an independent statutory body. Despite all the good intentions of CAVR staff, truth-seeking and truth-telling was subject to donor timelines and was expected to produce specific deliverables, namely a final report within a defined period. This meant that there was limited time for community consultation prior to the CAVR, for consulting with political leaders prior to releasing the final report, or for disseminating it within the community and encouraging community discussion and debate. And what has become very clear is that the East Timorese political leaders are minimally invested in the SHAGA recommendations, especially those concerning sensitive issues of justice and reparations. And while they sometimes reference the lessons of SHAGA, these lessons are referred to selectively and in ways that often serve political interests. It's also clear that very few political leaders and government bureaucrats have read the SHAGA report or are aware of its recommendations. An evaluation I was involved in several years ago found that although the report had been widely distributed to government officers at that stage, in many cases it had not been removed from its plastic wrap. And as Pat Walsh's point made earlier as well, the CAVR has thus far had very little impact on understandings of the Indonesian occupation amongst Indonesians. So all of this suggests that the current work of the CNC that Hugo is involved in, and also the civil society work that is currently taking place to encourage community discussions about SHAGA and integrate it into the school curriculum is also incredibly critical. So Timor-Leste's experiences in this regard seem to suggest that truth commissions can too easily allow states and international actors to draw a line between the past and the present, and in essence, recolonize the truth by co-opting it for their own purposes. So practically speaking, I think that this suggests that more time needs to go into thinking about the process, the long-term process of truth-telling. And Pat and Galuh have already talked about this as well, but how to, for example, to foster community and civil society engagement before, during, and after truth-telling, and how to encourage political leaders to invest in the process as well. The final set of questions I'd like to touch on relates to the kinds of knowledge or truths that truth commissions can hear. Most truth commissions, Timor-Lestes included, are based on an individualized model of truth-telling, in which personal stories are generally told or reproduced in a linear form. And these understandings of truth-telling have become so naturalized that they've come to seem universal. But I think it's important to think a bit about what truths are left out. Something that truth commissions are not always good at capturing is the structural dimensions of harm. And I want to acknowledge here that the CAVR did a very impressive job at documenting some of the structural dimensions of the occupation, including, for instance, how the violence of the occupation was connected to institutionalized practices of the Indonesian state, and was also facilitated by the complicity of Western states, including Australia. And there was, as Galuh also touched on, participatory truth-telling exercises as well that took place as part of the CAVR's work. Yet I think it would be fair to say that the most of the CAVR's truth-telling work was focused on capturing individual experiences of violence. And this individualized truth-telling model also tends to construct those who tell their stories as victims. In Timor-Leste, this construction left little space for recognizing experiences of collective struggle and resistance during the 24-year occupation. So one of the things I think could be interesting to think about is how truth-telling in Victoria might engage with the structural dimensions of colonialism, as well as with questions of Indigenous agency and resistance. And perhaps this is something we can discuss further, but I think this might be especially necessary in a context where there's a tendency to ignore the founding violence of colonialism and its ongoing impacts, and also to overlook Indigenous agency in dominant representations of the past. So finally here, like many truth commissions, the CAVR was not especially good at engaging with truths associated with Indigenous knowledge. For instance, truths associated with relations between humans and the land and with the spirit realm, including the ancestors, and truths that may not conform to a linear temporality. And in fact, I would say that most foreigners who've worked in Timor-Leste over the last 20 years, including myself, have not fully grasped the deep forms of violence enacted by the Indonesian occupation on relations between humans and the more than human world. Yet it's become increasingly evident to me in my recent work, actually, that in the wake of the formal truth-telling process, Indigenous knowledges and practices have become critical in locally ground processes of social recovery. So for instance, there's been a resurgence of practices that help to restore relations between humans, the spirit realm and the land, such as the rebuilding of sacred houses and rituals of recovering and reburying the bodies of those who died violent deaths during the occupation and whose spirits remain restless and unhappy. And the urgency that surrounds these practices speaks, I think, to the very real ways in which the spirit realm is felt to have an ongoing impact on the lives and the well-being of the living. So to conclude, I think it would be interesting to think about the kinds of approaches that might enable a greater recognition of Indigenous truths or forms of knowledge, and the extent to which this might help decolonize Western frames of knowing. For instance, could truth-telling take place in less formalized settings on country and in specific places, and in ways that enable socially shared truths to be expressed? How could truth-telling recognize relations between humans and the non-human world and allow for non-linear forms of storytelling? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lea, for that interesting and challenging presentation. I think it was a very interesting contrast between the people who are involved in the CAVR process and your kind of critique coming, I suppose, from a more slightly more academic perspective. And I'd be really interested to kind of maybe throw back some of those questions to to people who were involved in the commission, because obviously the legacy of the commission was complex, as is the case of all commissions around the world, and I think there obviously was an enormous amount of value in it, but at the same time there were fundamental, inevitably, limitations, and a lot of those limitations I think speak to relations of power in the context of power in which truth commissions are so often set up. So I mean, my understanding of the Europe Justice Commission is that it has attempted to do something slightly different to the traditional transitional justice process, but I think it's an incredibly difficult navigating act to, within the context of a royal commission, to create the space for more complex and, non-linear forms of truth. But I'd be really interested in, the Pat and Hugo and Galuh's kind of assessment of the extent to which you think things could have been done differently. Were there ways that the space could have been expanded? Was it possible to push back against the constraints that you were operating in? And then please, I'd love to hear from people in the audience, and we can take. I think we'll go for about 5 or 10 minutes extra because we finish quite late. So please, put up your virtual hands or put questions into the chat.
Could I briefly just jump in, Vanessa, and say that I don't mean also to critique the CAVR specifically, but really just to look at, I guess, the possibilities and limitations of the truth-telling model as a kind of global model. And I think actually the staff working on the CAVR did an incredible job with what they had. So yeah, that's I guess how my comments should be hopefully taken.
Yes, I mean, just to say on a personal level, I mean, my comments are framed by my own experience of the South African Truth Commission and knowing what it's actually like to work in those kind of constraints and how difficult it is. So, I mean, I know the enormous, value of the work that was done. I'm just interested in people's reflections on, whether there are spaces and how you navigate those complexities.
Can I have a go? Pat Walsh here. I think the two, Galuh and Hugo can comment on this, and Lea as well, but I think the two, when Hugo spoke, he mentioned the timing aspect. Why did CAVR start virtually straight after Indonesia left? The referendum, the act of self-determination, was August 99. CAVR was up and running 2002, but its brief, its legislation was 2001. So it was very, very quick off the mark. Why? I think there were two basic drivers. One was concern about continued violence in East Timor, that East Timor, having decided to go against Indonesia and therefore to part company with all the East Timorese militia who had been recruited in various ways by Indonesia to do their dirty work, and ordinary people had suffered terribly, had their homes burnt, displaced in the very rugged mountains without social services for months, forced across the border into West Timor, into refugee camps, plus, over 1,000 deaths alone in 99 when the UN was on the ground. So there was very, very strong possibility of revenge, payback by the victims having got what they wanted against extraordinary odds, self-determination, independence. Quite a few, as I said, a lot of the Indonesian formal army left, but there were quite a few local East Timorese who stayed, sort of tried their luck, and there was a fear that they or those that were seen to have been accomplished with them would engage in payback, and that would wreck the whole independence process and scare the pants off the international community, which against all the sort of received wisdom over the years that East Timor was too small, too poor, too neglected during 400 years or so of Portuguese colonialism to ever stand on its own feet, should be part of Indonesia, all that sort of stuff. The international community basically in 99 came down on the side of the right to self-determination, and that resulted in the decision, majority of East Timorese, to separate from Indonesia. That was a huge risk, if you like, taken by the international community, not least Canberra. And they were petrified that the whole thing would unravel, that violence would break out, would white ant, erode, destroy. The place would de-escalate into bloodletting and violence, and they'd be made a laughingstock, basically. So that was a major mover in the thing happening quickly. It was to short circuit the possibility of continued violence. The other one was very strong international expectation and Timorese expectation developed over the 25 years of the occupation, that what had happened was terribly wrong, and institutions, policies, governments, etc., had to be held accountable. You couldn't just turn the page and walk away from this, particularly what had happened in '99. So there was enormous pressure to basically establish the truth of what happened, who did it, and accountability for them, indictment, accountability, judicial processes, etc. Now, a lot of that didn't work in practice, but I think they were the two very big drivers. And they framed, it meant to answer, in a sense, Leah's question, how were a lot of the stories framed and presented? It framed the stories very much in the context of not just establishing the holistic truth, but the truth about specific human rights violations. The framework was the international rule of law framework, the international treaties, human rights apparatus, architecture, of course, around which the whole international community is supposed to be of one mind. That was the framework. So it didn't allow for, much digression, if you like, away from that. And when the statement taking was completed and all the evidence was collected back at the CAVR central office, the statement coders were trained and asked to identify, out of all these stories that they received, thousands of them, where was the human rights violation in international law in that evidence? And that was put into the database, and then that became the evidence of volume, where things happened, which institution was responsible, and what findings should be made. And CAVR came out with, it wasn't just assault or misdemeanor, what happened was torture. It was rape, not just other forms of sexual harassment, etc., etc. So I think it's really important to see this whole CAVR process very much as a human rights finding process with a judicial outcome as its objective.
Maybe I can add a little bit on the sort of although I mean I agree with Pat that it's really important that the human rights kind of perspective is at the end in the forefront, because that is the guide, that is the map for the future. And it's really important also in terms of people in Indonesia, the young generation, to understand it's not just the story of the brave volunteer fighters fighting against the mean occupiers, which is of course part of the truth. But I think the important thread is that violations were committed, human rights violations, massive human rights violations were committed by the Indonesian forces. And some violations were also committed by the resistance, even though in a smaller level, and it didn't constitute to crimes against humanity, but some of them, I think the Truth Commission made findings around war crimes. And it is important that we hold those lines, because these are the things that's happening. It's happening now in Rakhine State, it's happening now in Myanmar, in Aceh, in Papua, and we need those. They are boxes, these human rights violations, but we need those boxes so that we can kind of move away from the stories that are, you know, like those are the bad guys and we have to get rid of the terrorists, we have to get rid of the, you know, those kind of emotive stories, and look at the acts of human rights violations. But just on the thing of sort of indigenous worldview and storytelling, I mean, some of the stories that came through, I mean, I remember very clearly the story of a young girl from Aliana who talked about how the assault she experienced. She was like 13 years old or something. And then in her telling her story, she says, then the spirit of my mother came and took me and protected me and hid me somewhere. And, you know, when I was writing the report and reading through that testimony, I just burst out crying just because it just sort of touched me in a different way. And the fact that the CAVR, the other part is that we did a truth-telling process that used Indigenous culture around the community reconciliation process, which was a part of truth-telling where militias were given the opportunity to confess or to talk about what they did, their part in the violence of 1999. But that was very much done in the space of inside a cultural space. So they did something called Bitibot, which was opening the mat. They sat in the circle, and you know the elders opened the session, and they were the ones who did all the various sort of important, significant cultural meaning to that process, so that there could be some kind of community-based reconciliation. So I think there's some less there as well. But I think the main thing, if we're thinking of setting up a commission in Victoria and all that, is that, you know, a truth commission is not a magic bullet. It's not gonna solve all the problems. It's just an intense magnifying glass that you use to look at some issue, and then hopefully you come out with a human rights language about what happened. And you have to manage the expectations, and you have to work with civil society, because civil society is what's going to take on the long-term process of empowerment and accompaniment of survivors. And lastly, just to say that the Aceh Truth Commission was established under the Parliament law by Parliament, the Achenese Parliament, and it's been established as a permanent body because they've seen the problems with the CAVR, and then the more than 10 years of vacuum where, you know, it took a long time before we actually had the Central National Chega. So they have created a commission that will do truth-telling for the first 5 years, and then it will just then continue with reparations and memorialization and all that. So it's an interesting take. You know, it doesn't fit the TJ formula, but that's how they decided to do it.
Yes, Melinda, would you?
Thanks to all of you. This has been really tremendous. I'm very interested to hear a bit more about this. Is it the Centre of Memory, the museum that was established as a holding place for commission materials? Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about how that came about? What its scope is, whether it's funded well enough to do the kind of work into the future that you might wish it to, and what we see when we go there, how these kinds of questions we've been talking about in these last few minutes are handled at the level of making the commission and its work visible to a public.
Hugo, I think it's you, mate. Is Hugo there?
I heard him chuckle.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I think, well, Centro Chega was established by law. I think Pat Walsh is part of this long and very complex process when the government decided to establish the Centro Nacional Chega. Even that, as you all know, that Centro Chega as a public institution, as an Institute of Memory, is part of one of the recommendations of the Commission at the time. By law, Centro Chega is mandated to promote and monitor the implementation of the recommendations. So that's the first mandate of Centro Nacional Chega. And what we did so far in the last 4 years is first to reintroduce what is CAVR, what is Chega, and also what is the Truth and Friendship Commission of Indonesia. Because after 10 years, the changes of the government in Timor-Leste, these two initiatives was almost outside of the political discourse in Timor-Leste. So our main challenge at the time is how to reintroduce CAVR, Chega to the government, particularly. Since 2001. So some of them even don't know, never see what is Chega and what is the content of the Chega. So what we did is first, of course,
Hi, Hugo, I think you're dropping out.
We were also mandated to continue preserve the past memory and make use of those memories for the intention of education, reconciliation, and also provide support for the survivors. So, of course, our very fundamental reference is CAVR report, Chega, and also all those archives. We have more than 50,000 archives from CAVR time, where we collected through all this mechanism, but also we continue to collect and then the new source of information from what we did in the last 4 years. So far, I must admit that we haven't done much in terms of integrating the recommendation into the government policy. We have some successful stories, but also we have some very complex, very time-consuming discussions and dialogue with different line ministers in order for them to integrate all the recommendations into the policy. This is particularly because, for example, in the last 4 years, we have 3 different governments. And every time the changes of government, we need to restart the process from the beginning because the new ministers, and then also, of course, the government set up by the political party, and they have their own priority to integrate into the government program as well. But so far, we have been able to make very good progress with some of the line ministries, particularly the Minister of Education, integrating Chega content to the curriculum. We have developed a curriculum for the 3rd cycle in high school back in 2009. But again, now we're facing this process that because of the changes of the government, we need to wait for the minister to approve the process. Currently, we work with Minister of Higher Education in revising the social science curriculum, which is sent to Chega, was invited to be part of the working group. Particularly for supporting the survivor, it is one of the program that we work in with different line ministries. One of the quite success progress made with Minister of Social Solidarity in terms of providing financial scheme to some of the survivors. We work with Minister of State Administration at the moment in providing housing to mostly the victim of sexual violence during the period of occupation and also political conflict, internal conflict. We currently in a process of integrating Chega into the curriculum of Police Academy and also National Institute of Defense to make sure that our armed forces and police officers, from the beginning, they understand what happened in Timor-Leste during the 24 years. This is one of the main biggest challenges, because even up to now, we still the community still experience excessive forces, use of forces by police and armed forces in dealing with very non-serious conflict in Timor-Leste. So, so far, most of the funding coming from the government, the state budget, and I must say that at least in the last 4 years, we have been significantly increased our salary from 800,000 in 2017. Our current budget is 3.1 million. So that's the show that there are interest from government to continue support Centro Chega in order to implement those recommendations. Of course, there are a lot of recommendations, more than 200 recommendations, but we need to select those most urgent one. Particularly now, in the last 2 years, we have been focusing in our reparation program, which is particularly pay attention to the survivors of the conflict. So that's what so far we have been doing, and also we continue to start to receive also international donors support. Maybe in the next month, we were going to sign another cooperation agreement with COICA with $5 million for the next 4 years. This is particularly to focus on education, to develop the better curriculum for primary and secondary school in Timor-Leste, training for the teachers, and also creating network of teachers in the region. Particularly history and human rights teachers in the region. So, and also we also receive funding from 2 different institutions at the moment, from French corporations and French Embassy in Jakarta, and also one of the foundation in the United States in digitalization of the archive. So far, we are very much doing very good progress in terms of preserving the archive, but also slowly introduce the recommendation into the government line ministries program and policy. One of the recommendations, Pat, you may remember, one of the things that recommended by the working group is that to integrate Chega content into the National Development Strategy, which is currently we working with one of the vice prime minister is to integrate more Chega content as one of the national priority of Timor-Leste. So, so far that's the progress that we have been doing in the last 4 years, particularly in the last 2 years. I think there's some of the good progress. I have to admit that it's been happening in the last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, for that quite amazing overview of an extraordinary amount of work. It was very impressive. I think we've got 9:15, so I think it's, if there are no outstanding questions, I'd just like to really thank the speakers and to everybody who was here today. Thank you very much for coming and participating, and I hope you're able to join us in subsequent events that we have around truth telling and to continue this conversation. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.